The last few updates to Ghost Simulator have been kind of small, focusing on second arc NPCs and other small changes just to the small little problems in Ghost Simulator. But because of that, I've been kind of falling behind a little bit on the second arc lore, and so because of that, I will be going ahead and taking a look at Ghost Hunter Hikari in this video. Now, Ghost Hunter Hikari is a new NPC for the second arc of Ghost Simulator, which is basically after you have rebirthed for the first time and is a continuation of lore. Now, the first thing about this NPC is its location in the volcano, and we'll get a little bit more to what I thought that meant later, but for now, we can just continue on and start into the actual dialogue of it. And the first part of her questline is really setting up quite a bit of stuff for the rest of her quest, and really contains a lot of lore to really dig into. The first part of it more has to do with her character and how she acts, but a big one that was brought up is her relation as a cousin to both Rowan and Yoko, which are both brothers already, and setting up this family structure is kind of cool. Moving on, she shows some of her personality and how she's been quite alone quite a bit, and that's kind of shaped her a little bit with having some grief and other problems because of that. And then right at the end of it, it goes into this big bombshell about how rebirthing, even though it gives the player really good perks, it really is hurting the NPCs in a way. And that's sort of the big crux of the whole questline, it feels like, as you go into it, since it is quite a big deal for the player's progression to actually be kind of hurting all the NPCs that they're really working with in the story. Now that we're done with the opening dialogue, the lore really starts to slow down a bit with quests between every single new batch of dialogue. And what's remarkable about the quest is that it's basically the same exact layout of quests as Ghost Hunter Blaze has in the volcano, which kind of makes sense seeing how they are positioned and somewhat related, as we'll again get to a little bit later. Her next dialogue goes over more detail about the rift explosion that Blaze caused and how that caused Hikari to go into a state of non-existence. As you continue to progress through her questline, she starts to outline more of her non-existence, starting with how she met Archie and slowly was able to interact with the environment to get his attention. Finishing the next quest gives you an interesting piece of dialogue, telling you that the quests that you complete may not be actually for the right people, and kind of indicates that it'll be a surprising turn to see who the actual enemy is in this whole ordeal. Going onward, she starts to reveal some of her powers, like being able to interact with different planes of existence, including going into Ghost World, where she was able to see ethereal figures. As she continues on, she notes that this power is kind of useful for the leader of the AOF, and is probably important to the AOF mission. Going onward, she explains how she followed the player into the Easter event, and while there, she was surprised that Ella was actually able to see her, and remarked that there were tons of different things that the player can't even see in the world, and much more going on than we really know. The next bit of dialogue is also kind of interesting, noting how I didn't have to pick a side on the first arc, and how that would have played much big difference in the outcome of the first arc lore. And it continues on in that same dialogue to go mention how the backups that are made for the data that the AOF is collecting can sometimes be ditzy, and these backups are from when the player rebirths. Backups need to be made of all the data so that people can actually store stuff after a player rebirths. The next interesting bit of dialogue comes a few quests later, where she notes that something said that ghosts were being aggressive, and how she's always found ghosts to be kind of peaceful and would rather peacefully live with them without having to vacuum them or anything like that. It also has dialogue referring to Bo as a peaceful ghost and really likable, and notes about a remnant that is very similar to him that she once saw. Next bit of dialogue cements that it is Bo she's referring to, and actually says that he is a trustworthy one, and talks a little bit more about the remnant that she saw of him. Based on this, I would guess that Bo's remnant is going to be the antagonist or villain of second arc, because Bo is a very lovable character even though he acts like a villain, so it makes sense that someone that's like him but slightly different would actually be the true villain of this arc. Next dialogue goes into detail on how currently the AOF leader is trying to open a portal into a new, potentially beta form of Ghost World over in the Ghost World currently. Since that's kind of already been released, this lore is kind of a little bit late on that, but it also talks about how this might be the source of the other AOF's visions and other problems. Her next dialogue does a really good job of showing one of the current tasks for her, which is stalling the player to give time for the AOFs to do something else. This is interesting to note that they don't want the player intervening with them. Isn't too noteworthy other than the obvious. The next lot of dialogue goes into more detail on her current experience and her character development, really, especially with her and her cousins Yoko and Rowan. And although this isn't super important to lore, it is kind of touching to see for a character to have this, but isn't, as I said, super useful for the second arc lore as a whole. But once you get through that, there is one final statement that I found very interesting, and that was her indication that she's finally found a place in this world, and that she actually seeks to go help find remnants, a place in the world too, which kind of outlines potentially the AOF's motive, which is to find a place for the remnants of the game to lodge. Now, that is all the lore I could find in Ghost Hunter Hikari's dialogue, but as I said, there was one more bit of information that I found very interesting for her, and that was her placement in the volcano, and very similar quest structure to Ghost Hunter Blaze. And because of that, and the fact that the previous 3 NPCs also followed NPC organization falling in the same biome as Adam, Jesse, and Finsley, it was pretty clear to me at this point that the developers were following a similar NPC layout to what they were doing originally, and probably were going to add a new NPC over into the forest later in the next update. And since the forest NPC Luna for the first arc lore was the leader, and the next NPC to be added was going to be the AOF leader, it felt natural to me that the next NPC to be added would be the leader in the forest. But at this point, since when the Hikari was first released, there was already a 100th update event with Shelly already in the forest in a very similar position as the other second arc NPCs in relation to Luna. I became convinced that Shelly was going to be the AOF leader, and her placement in the forest before Hikari was going to be kind of confirmation of that. And that was sort of set me down this sort of rabbit hole, which we'll get into a little bit later. Now, one of the big things for this theory is that Shelly fit a lot of the boxes that we already needed for the AOF leader. She was female, she was a bit tech savvy, she was definitely related to remnants and other stuff, since she was almost deleted herself in a way, and kind of had that experience of being controlled by the developers and a few other things that make it interesting, since she does also have a remnant that we know of. And all those things kind of collaborated into me thinking that Shelly would be the next AOF leader. And as it turned out, Riley would be in the Ghost World, but still, that is what those indicated to me. And I think with that was all the lore and second arc information I gathered from Ghost Hunter Hikari. If there's anything I missed, feel free to leave a comment. And if you want a similar video to this for Riley or any of the future second arc NPCs, please let me know, since it does take me a little bit of time and these aren't always my favorite videos to make. So, knowing that you guys like them can do a little bit to encourage me to make more of them in the future. And with that, I'll see you guys in my next video or stream.